Hello, this is Dr. Anthony Delmond. Today we're going to talk about communication. We're going to start out with a conversation about verbal communication, then we're going to move on to nonverbal components of communication, and we're going to spend the last bit of time talking about some barriers that we typically run into in terms of our communication with each other. By the end of this lecture, hopefully you can identify all the steps of the communication process, all the elements, how messages are encoded and decoded by buyers and sellers, and some of the things that go into that. You should be able to discuss the differences between verbal and nonverbal communication. There are some pretty important definitions in there that you should understand. You should be able to understand the receiving side of communication, so for example, levels of listening and issues of retention, how well we remember the information. You should understand how people grasp nonverbal communication cues. You should be able to do some of that on your own, and you should be able to talk about the elements of nonverbal communication very specifically. And lastly, you should be able to identify and navigate some of the common barriers to communication. Communication can be very difficult, and meaning can hinge on just the slightest movement or minor inflection. There's a good example of this that you can walk through in the book, going through the same sentence spoken in a number of different ways or accompanied by different nonverbal cues. You can see that they're very different meanings. So how do we figure out what somebody means? Well, we need to take all those elements into account. So what is verbal communication? Well, it's not just what's spoken. Verbal communication is any communication that uses words. So this could be written, it could be spoken, but it's the element of communication that uses words. That's what that verb piece means. By contrast, nonverbal communication is communication that doesn't use words. So I don't know why, but for some reason we always associate verbal communication with oral communication, but they're different. So make sure that you understand verbal just means it uses words, nonverbal means that it is not the part that uses words. Communication, on the other hand, is the process that conveys a message from person to person, person to people, people to a person, or so on. But it's the communication of, it's the conveying of a message from one to another. All right, so there are several elements of communication. There's the message, that's what's being said, and there's the sender who's saying it. There's the receiver, that's the person who is receiving whatever that message is. And then there is the actual encoding process. So the sender is going to take that message, turn it into maybe a certain set of words, a certain set of nonverbal communication elements, and they're going to send it to the receiver. The receiver is then going to decode it, take all the verbal and nonverbal elements and determine what the meaning is, what the message is, according to them. And then they're going to provide feedback to the sender about what message they received. So they're going to have their own encoding process to encode a message to send back to the sender, and the sender's going to have to decode that feedback. So it's a loop. And in between, there is noise. Noise is any element that stops the simple conveyance of a message. This could be actual physical noise, which makes it hard to hear, or it could be anything that disrupts the message's transfer. This could be somebody's cell phone going off and not paying full attention. It could be any number of things that stop that message from getting from one place to another. So let's go through a few of these. The medium of communication, this is going to be the method or tool used for conveying a message. So the medium might be something like a telephone or a letter or some way that it's being transferred. And there's a few different ones that we're going to talk about here. There's 4 broad classes. The first is written. Any communication method that utilizes the written word. This could be letters, emails, books. All of these are going to be things that are read, and so therefore they're written communication. Oral communication is anything that uses the spoken word. So the receiver has to listen to get the message. And there's a lot of communication media that use multiple at once. Visual is any communication method that uses images or a presentation where the receiver has to observe but not necessarily read the message. It could contain words, but it doesn't need to. And then there's sensory. This is a little bit more complex to discuss, but this is a communication or a communication method that uses elements that are meant to be touched or sensed. So the reader has to engage with or sense the content to understand it. We might think about this in terms of real estate. A lot of times a realtor will put the smell of cookies or an aerosol in to make the house smell a certain way to give people the experience of hominess. And that's to convey the message that this place could be your home, but it's not sensed or interpreted through written, oral, or visual elements. It's interpreted through the sensory elements. So some communication media can be verbal or nonverbal. Oral communication usually has some verbal and nonverbal components. Obviously, when we're talking to somebody, we're making gestures, we're making different intonations with our voice. We might speak slower or much faster, and all of these convey pieces of the message. Sensory communication can include several things. It can include haptic elements, things that have to be touched to be communicated. Smell we discussed before, taste, or environmental elements that are much more subtle and intangible. So things like ambiance. Very hard to put into a specific sense, but definitely conveys a message to the receiver. As far as encoding and decoding, a sender has to take the message, encode it into the medium of communication that's chosen. So if this is in the form of a pamphlet, there's going to be a process where the sender of the message has to write it all down and determine how best to arrange it. The receiver then, as I said before, is going to have to decode the message in whatever communication medium is used, and then provide feedback to acknowledge that there was some receipt of this message, but also to let the sender know if there's something else that needs to be addressed. So a lot of times that feedback provides information to the sender to know whether that sender's encoding process was successful. Again, every step along the way, there could be some noise, but this commonly happens during the transmission of the message or the feedback. So getting the message from one person to another usually has some risk for noise disrupting that message conveyance, and the same thing at the back end when the receiver is sending information back to the sender. You want to consider tailoring your script. So any good communicator or salesperson is going to encode a message very deliberately so it can be decoded without error by the specific person that it's meant for. So in the context of sales, a salesperson should tailor the message to the individual buyer and the situation. We talked about some buying situations before, but this is where we want to make sure we are thinking about all of the aspects of this when creating our message and encoding our message. Tailoring a full sales presentation is more feasible for person-to-person sales when the number of buyers is small. It's much harder to tailor a message when there's a large group because everybody's got different things that they want to focus on, different personality types, and different buying situations, perhaps. And it's also easier or more feasible when each buyer represents a substantial portion of the company's sales revenues. If you're able to spend a lot of time on one person because that person is going to be a large buyer, you're going to be able to tailor that script better. I should clarify a bit. For the first one here, tailoring to a small number of buyers, this is when the buying group is small. If you're selling to a group of buyers at the same time, you can't really tailor it. The second one is more about if you're selling to a single buyer, but you're having to reach out to 100 potential buyers in a day, you're going to be able to tailor less to each individual one. So it's more useful if you have key accounts or somebody that is going to be buying a large portion of your product for the day. You know to tailor more to those people and you don't have to focus as much on the little guys. It's easiest when the salesperson is familiar with the customer. We'll talk a little bit about building those relationships. So we talked about it in the past, but we may come up with more discussion of CRMs and keeping the information ready to go as we move forward. Another important thing is how you frame your conversation. So framing involves the arrangement or context of the problem how you put it so that a customer understands what you're getting at. I have a good example in the textbook of a joke for this, but if you frame things in a positive light, that the decision is the purchase decision is a way for a buyer to solve a problem that you recognize they have, it's going to be better than just telling them that this is a product they can have. So the way you frame your presentation can have pretty significant consequences. A good salesperson will use a framework where the buyer feels like they're coming to a decision on their own rather than being led to it. People want to feel like they've made a decision on their own. So it's really important as a salesperson to allow them to feel like they've come to that decision on their own. Setting up a sort of logical reasoning structure can be really good. You can set up the premises on which they're making the conclusion. I think that's a good place to stop. We'll come back and talk about the difference between hearing and listening.